it looks like Rule Zero is being a huge conversation again on Twitter amongst Magic the Gathering players, so maybe it's time to go ahead and have a conversation about Rule Zero again. Now, I've already made a few statements that I do not think that Rule Zero is a very effective conversation, typically, at least not the way that people tend to have it, generally speaking. What do I mean by that? Well, the usual Rule Zero conversation for Magic the Gathering goes a little something like this. You are player A, and player B, C, D, they're all at the table. Player A says, hey, I want to play my Mishra deck. It does vehicle stuff. Player B goes, okay, cool, what's its power level? And you give a non-committal 6 or 7. And then everybody else brings out their decks, and they're all 6s or 7s. And maybe one guy is feeling a little more honest than normal, and they say that they have a 8 for their deck, and that's it. And you bring all that to the table, and then somebody pub stomps the entire table, nobody has fun, and then you end up having to pull out new decks to play a different game. Oh, but wait, there's a problem. The player who pub stomped everybody just conveniently only has one deck on them, so there's no real way they can manage to play a different deck. Somebody at the table offers them to play one of their decks, and they go, nah, that's okay, I really only like playing with my cards. And, you know, that's an entirely valid thing to do, say, or feel. I know that there's a lot of neurodivergent people in the Magic the Gathering communities, and a lot of personal ownership goes into the cards you have, so that's understandable. So what do you do with that fourth player? What do you manage there? So at my LGS, there's a bit of a stopgap with this particular problem. You see, at my LGS, we have a CEDH and a casual tournament. So if somebody is doing the pub stomping thing, very quickly they become a known factor to everyone at the shop, because everybody at the shop is playing with one another. And warnings can be given out at the beginning of games, depending on who is sitting down at a table. This is also a type of a Rule Zero discussion. If there is a person who's coming to sit down at your pod, and they are a known problematic player for various reasons, let's say they do the whole, oh, my deck's not CDH, it just happens to have all of this fast mana, and it just happens to have these 5 tutors in it, but it's not CDH because, don't worry, I'm not running the Thoracle combo, I'm running some other infinite combo. When that happens, there's only so many times that kind of player can get a game in before everybody starts recognizing, okay, eliminate that player first every time we play. And over time, that can create a bit of a course correction for that player where they've been signaled out first to be knocked out of so many games. Then maybe there's an internal dialogue of, why am I always the first one targeted? And sometimes it's not because people think they are the first person that needs to go for the game to progress well. Sometimes it's they're simply tired of dealing with that person, and they'd rather the game be a 3-player game without them, and this is their way within the mechanics of Magic the Gathering to communicate that to that player. There's a conversation to be had about whether that behavior is okay, but at the same time, that's a metagaming discussion. That's a thing we did on the podcast recently, so maybe go check that out. But why is this Rule Zero discussion stuff being such a problem for people again? I think a lot of it comes down to players don't know how to communicate about their decks. Players don't know how to communicate what kind of game they want to have, and this also may be another problem with there being a very high representation of neurodivergence in Magic the Gathering. It turns out that it can be very hard to put yourself in someone's shoes. Not just for people who are neurodivergent, but really anybody, it can be difficult. But it can be especially hard for somebody who is, say, on the spectrum to put themselves in the shoes of another person and try to figure out how they felt about something. Oftentimes, the only perspective that will matter to them is theirs. Again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. That is simply a quirk of how that works. But how do we navigate those spaces in order to have fun games with one another where we are not having to resort to basically mechanically bullying a person off of a table in order to have a fun game that also technically had that person in there as well? I think if we change our discussions about Rule Zero and power level, that will help a ton. So when you're talking about the power level of your deck, what does that mean? Are we talking about the budget of the deck? Are we talking about the turn that it wins? Are we talking about the type of deck as it is? Are you using a stacks deck, an infect deck, etc.? Are we talking about how consistently the deck does its thing and on what turn it manages to do that? And the unfortunate thing is, the answer is not any one of those things. It is, in fact, all of those things and possibly more. If I bring my Sephiroth deck to a table, I have to, in order to not feel bad for playing that deck, I have to let everybody at the table know, hey, this is an Esper control deck. It has a small blinking out of the graveyard sub-theme, and it is a primarily reanimator deck. The deck will do a lot of things to you if you do not stop it from doing so, and pulling out my budget version of the deck will only lower its power ever so slightly by making my mana curve a little more awkward. That's really the only thing that happens when I switch to the budget version of the deck. That's $15 instead of $350. Hell, we can look at my Sephiroth deck as an example right now, one of the strongest decks that I have. If I bring this to a table, I have to let people know, hey, there are 6 board wipes in this deck of varying flavors. I can and will slow a game down if I feel like somebody is going too fast. The copies and the dungeon stuff, not really super important, but the amount of interaction that's in the deck, the 15-card thick interaction suite that is endlessly recurrable because of how the deck works, that's also something that I tend to have to communicate to people who haven't fought with the deck before. I could do the whole it's a dungeon deck and dungeons are one of the weakest mechanics that Wizards has ever produced, and it's not really that strong of a deck because of that mechanic. I could lie like that. I could do that, but I feel like it's much more fun if people realize what they're dealing with. Like, do you, as a player, feel like you're having more fun when everybody at the table knows what they have brought, knows how powerful it is, and operates accordingly? Or do you feel good only when you get to blindside the table with the power of your deck and you get to dazzle them with your infinite combo that, trust me, they've seen 12 billion times in a YouTube short because they are a Magic the Gathering player and every single bit of technology you have is listening to you pee? Trust me, they've seen your combo that you are oh so proud of somewhere. Which are you more happy with? And if you are only happy when dazzling the table with your super cool 2-card combo, then how often do you think you're going to continue to get games with the people at that table? Your combo's not very unique or cool. It's just a thing that you enjoy doing because it makes you feel very powerful. As a community of players, we should want to bring that person, the person I just described, who you probably either are being very introspective about that person being you, or you're probably thinking about who that person is at your LGS. The goal is not to ostracize that person. The goal is not to ostracize you if you are that person. The goal is not to knock the person out of being able to play with games if they play with you in games if they are that person as well. The goal is, how do we include that person into games? And this is where we run into the problem. Rule Zero only works when people can communicate effectively with one another. And the most lazy discussion about your deck you can possibly have is the power level discussion. Now, a lot of different people have tried to use various mechanisms to try to give some tangibility to power level in Commander, to try to make these things make sense to people. 3 years ago, there was a Reddit thread that did this. I'll go ahead and bring it up right now. A guide to power levels in EDH, how to read this chart. Unfocused, janks or meme decks, focused, low power casual, tuned, mid-level casual, normal decks, normal levels of power to many, optimized, high power casual, and competitive, literally see EDH. And I feel like this might be closer to something that is usable. This is not the same thing as saying my deck's a 6, my deck's a 7, because everybody's going to say their deck's a 6, their deck's a 7. It's shorthand. Also, the reason that shorthand doesn't work is If your deck is a 7, it's because you are experiencing games with other people who are playing decks of a similar power to you. If you always win your games, so you say your deck's probably an 8, that's only in relation to the people that you are playing games with. I saw this happen at my LGS, where a player sat down with a Send Triplets deck and said the deck wasn't CEDH. Now, other people came to the table, saw the deck while we were playing in a casual pod, looked at his hand, saw his field, noticed that it was nothing but stacks pieces, the hand had plenty of tutors in it ready to go, and there was plenty of removal in the deck, and infinites were sitting in the 99 of the deck as well. Now, the player said their deck was not CEDH, and they didn't end up being the one that won that game, but it's the type of game that you end up having. Send Triplets normally is a Staxy style of deck to begin with, but Send Triplet CDH is stacks to the point where people are not able to play the game because you're trying to stop 1 and 2 turn decks from going off, and then you do an infinite combo. Demonic Consultation Thassa's being one of the easiest ones to go for, but it's certainly not the only one that Send Triplets can go for. Was the deck CEDH? According to everybody who looked through the person's 99, yes, it looked very close to similar Send Triplet CEDH lists that many people had dealt with before. But when you're having that game, the reason that was given to us that the deck wasn't CEDH is the person had played the deck with other players who were CEDH players, and it never performed well. There are, of course, 2 different ways to look at that scenario. Way 1 is going, we can't account for how well you personally pilot the deck. Way 2, and probably a much more fair way to look at it, is the general power level of CEDH can vary depending on where you're at. Now, where I am in the northern Atlanta area, CEDH players are very competitive. They travel around to different states to go to different tournaments to try to win prize money. So the bar for CEDH commanders is very, very high. If you play a tier 3 CEDH deck, you're not going to perform as well here as you might if you go to a different state that is less competitive, say like mid-Florida or anywhere in Alabama. I'm in Georgia and in the Atlanta area, so take that for what it's worth. Based on your region, that will affect the power level of your deck. So trying to have that power level discussion with just the deck is or is not CEDH, or the deck is a 7, or any of that is not going to be effective, because where you are matters. I haven't personally played Magic the Gathering up in, say, New York, but I know that the Yu-Gi-Oh! Crowds up there, back when I played Yu-Gi-Oh!, were very, very competitive. The Yu-Gi-Oh! Crowds over where Billy Brake is in Texas were very, very competitive, and I had the culture shock of being a, quote, competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Player in Florida, and then when I moved to Georgia and started playing with all of the players from the Atlanta region, I realized how woefully inadequate the type of game I had been playing up till now was. And that's kind of the way that it feels with Magic as well, with everyone around here. So how do you even have that discussion with power level when you know for a fact that you are going to, as a player, have a very biased opinion on your deck's power? I play a deck that is very powerful for where I am, and if I go to a place that has an LGS that doesn't run Commander tournaments and just has a handful of people that hang out on Saturdays, those players are not incentivized to put the same power pieces in their deck, even in their casual decks. So they might not actually have what they need to stand up to some of the more tuned decks out there. So you need to have more honest discussions about your deck. The easiest way to do that is, instead of a power level 1, sit down for Rule 0 discussions and say, hey, this is, in my case, this is my Sephiroth deck. The deck has a lot of removal. The deck runs a lot of board wipes. The deck needs to be controlled not from the board, but from the graveyard. If you spend time controlling my board, I will simply get it right back. The deck does, in fact, have an infinite combo, but the combo requires me to put 6 cards together. However, the most important part of the combo is Radiant Solar. If you make sure my Radiant Solar never gets to do anything, then my deck will not crumble, but it will certainly not be able to speed its way into its winning state. Instead, it's going to have to fight very, very hard to get there. Yes, it will still protect itself. Yes, it will still bring stuff back, but if you have a piece of exiling removal and you know that I'm sitting on enough mana, or you know that I've discarded Radiant Solar, it's probably a good idea to get rid of it to overcome me specifically. You don't have to tell people about every combo in your deck, like how the way my deck is built, if I get even a single way to reanimate something out of my graveyard, I'll be reanimating, say, Sister Hospitaller, who will then reanimate one of my clone creatures, who will then become a copy of Sister Hospitaller and give me a full board of blockers and refresh my life from 10 back up to about 30. You don't have to tell them about every little trick your deck can do, but what does a winning board state look like for your deck? Maybe tell people what that is. How does your deck operate? Mine's a control deck. It will try to slow the game down. If you're not here to play a game where I try to slow it down, maybe some of y'all are strapped for time, I can grab a different deck. The deck does contain an infinite combo. If you are not here to play a game where a deck will win out of nowhere because of an infinite combo, then maybe I'll play a different deck. And that's even recognizing the infinite combo is about a 5 or 6 card combo. I'll at least be honest and say it's there. Sometimes somebody just has a pit of offerings and they can snipe one of the pieces away, and then suddenly the infinite doesn't work, and now we're playing fair magic again. I don't think that's a very hard conversation to have, and I managed that in about 35 seconds. I think if every player at the table has that exact conversation, what does my deck do? How does it get there? How fast does it do it? What turn am I trying to win by? And what does a strong board look like for my deck? And if my deck doesn't have its ideal board state, does it have an infinite that it can use to establish a win? And how consistently does my deck do that? That is a way to have that discussion where everybody is honest enough about what their deck is doing that most of your Rule Zero problems will probably go away. Now, I know that there are some people who have given me comments before saying that they don't want to have the Rule Zero conversation because time is money, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to go ahead and say play a different card game. I'm just going to say play a different card game. If you do not want to have a discussion about what kind of game you're wanting to play, then maybe do not play an exclusively social card game format. There are other Magic the Gathering formats you can play. You can play Standard. You can play CEDH, where there is no Rule Zero discussion. Everybody knows they're going in there for the strongest game possible. They're throwing every haymaker out there, and the stacks in a CEDH game get massive whenever one person plays their first win con, and then everybody at the table plays a series of counterspells to eventually make sure that something does not resolve. Those feats can be magical to be a part of and see, and if you want to experience Commander while still having no Rule Zero discussion, that format is there for you and ready. And if you're worried about the price point of that format, many CEDH players are perfectly fine with you proxying your deck, because I'm going to be honest, nobody has $6,000 to drop on a CEDH deck, and anybody that thinks that you should have $6,000 to drop on a CEDH deck is stupid and or very, very privileged. So we'll just go ahead and get them out of the discussion right now. They can out themselves in the comment section if they so choose. That is their prerogative. If you are playing a social format, you have to understand that there are 3 other players at the table, and the expectation is not throat punching for every player there. Yes, every player at that table probably wants to win. Yes, every player at that table is going to be doing what they can to eke towards a victory. But the way that those victories are achieved and the way that you get there is as important to most Commander players as anything else. And a lot of this comes back to how Commander began. Commander began as a format that was a side format. This was something that players made for themselves, or a set of judges specifically made for themselves as a way to have fun and play a bunch of stuff that normally would not see play in a deck that they could use whenever they were not judging at an event, or whenever they were done judging at an event, or between rounds at an event. This was something they could do to kill time and have fun. Because of that, the way the format is built is very, very loose. Even CEDH tournaments do not use maximum level rules enforcement. The social contracts of this game are as important to this game's functioning as the actual rules of the game. And understand, there's always ways around this. If you have a dedicated pod of people that you play with all the time, that can be a way to circumvent a lot of the Rule Zero discussion. If everybody you're playing with is very familiar with every deck that you normally play, then you don't have to spend time talking about those decks. If you are wanting to spend time playing with a lot of different people at various LGSs, then there's a few good habits you could get in that will let you do that in a more enjoyable fashion. First, obviously, like I said, when you're having your Rule Zero discussion, don't just talk about deck power level. That's a shorthand that we don't all agree on the actual terms for. State what your deck does, how fast it gets there, what kind of budget you were looking at when you built the deck could even be part of that discussion. How consistent is it? And are there any things that players need to be responsible for or watch out for when you're playing? The next thing, very, very helpful, but this is entirely based on budget, don't just bring one deck to a tournament. I've literally built this channel off of making several $15 decks, all of which are similar in power level, but of course there are ways in which they are disparate. My Hydra deck is very, very strong when left unchecked, but much weaker when people are aiming a lot of removal at Zaxara, for instance. I know because I have that deck in physical, the $15 one, and there was a player who was new to Magic the Gathering at my local tournament who played with a friend's deck, had a little bit of fun. I handed him my Zaxara deck, and now he is full sail on Hydras. Apparently, he just wants to build a Zaxara deck of his own now because he played mine, and it made big dirtle creatures, and when you're a new player, getting a creature out who's 15/15 feels like a magical Disney ride, I guess. So, having multiple decks, and having multiple budget decks so that you have a wide variety of things to play that may not necessarily be the most powerful ever, gives you options. Option one, when you're having your Rule Zero discussion, you can say, hey, I have a deck here that's control, a deck here that's aggro, a deck here that's a little mid-rangey. It has the ability to punch really fast, but it's also running a decent bit of control pieces. I have this combo deck here, and then I have this for fun deck here that's, it just has artifacts in it, and I like artifacts. And you throw those decks at the table and ask people, hey, what kind of deck do you want me to play with? If somebody says, sure, go ahead and pick whatever, then that's fine. Do that. When you have a variety of decks with you that you bring to a shop, that gives you the flexibility to change the power level of what you're doing based on what people are comfortable playing with. Because the goal of a commander table, I will go ahead and say the goal of every commander player should not be just to win your games, but to be invited to the next one. That may seem strange because we're used to playing in tournaments where of course you're going to be invited to the next round. It's coming up in the next round. You have to play it. But generally speaking, if you are playing casual commander and your LGS doesn't have a commander league of some kind, or even if it does, you want to be the type of player that people want to play with. It's like going to your friend's house and playing Super Smash Brothers. You want to be the type of player that gets invited to go to your friend's house again, because that lets you play video games with your friends more. And why don't you want to play video games with your friends more? If you want to go out, make friends, socialize, and I'm going to be honest, better your mental health, because taking time to spend time with other human beings does in fact do that. It helps your mental health more than you might know. Be the type of player that other players want to play with. Don't obfuscate the stuff your deck is doing. You're not gaining anything from that. You win in a card game. Everybody will have forgotten that victory a week from now, including you. It wasn't that important. But if you are honest about what your decks do, and when players see what the deck does, and they knew it was coming, and they weren't able to stop it, or they tried and you were able to masterfully move your way through it, however you want to describe the situation, and you actually were honest the entire time, people are going to be much more thankful that you were in their pod. You want people to actively seek you out to come to their pods. It is one of the most wonderful feelings as a commander player to be able to not only sit down and play this game that we all recognize we like with other people, but for other people to want to play the game with us. for people to want to play the game with you. And if you have really good Rule Zero discussions, it'll be easier to facilitate those kind of games. I'll give you a couple of examples. Games that there are people at my shop who, if they are watching this video and they are the person who was a part of that game, then they can honestly say, oh, yeah, no, I was there. That's a thing that happened. Both of these actually involve my Sephiroth deck, one with the $15 version and one with the full power version. In scenario one, I sit down at a table and there's a player who is playing Prosper and complaining that they always get targeted because they are playing a Prosper deck even though they are a budget player. The budget of their deck is about $45, which, you know, notably is $5 more expensive than the Prosper Precon was back when it was considered affordable by normal human beings with normal jobs. So I said, hey, I don't think you should be using a budget deck as a shield for, you know, not being targeted. Here's what I'll do. Would you like me to pull out one of my budget decks? It's a $15 deck, and I'll play it at the table, and I will let you all know I am the arch enemy. You have to stop me. If you do not stop me, I will take over the game. I was using my $15 Sephiroth build. There's a video about that. You can look it up if you want. I did end up winning that game. Almost at time. We have 50-minute timers on our tournament, but almost at time, did end up winning the game, and that is a game now that I always have in the back of my head, and that player who is playing the Prosper deck always has in the back of their head too. Now, that player, when they are playing their games, instead of complaining that they're being targeted, might actually start running with, oh, I am the arch enemy, I need to be able to 1v3 everybody here. That is something I need to do because I'm playing a commander that is a known problem, and everybody who sees my commander knows, oh, if they get 10 treasures, they're going to win with Reign of Riches or something like that. Unless they have the conversation in Rule Zero that I don't have any of those instant win cons that you would typically see in a Prosper deck. So that was one game that was a teaching moment for another player, but there was another one that was with my full power Sephiroth deck that actually involved one of the players from that budget game. We're at the tournament, and I'm playing my regular Sephiroth deck, and I forget what the actual discussion on what kind of game we were going to have for that tournament match was, but I basically said, okay, I'm going to play my arch enemy deck. This is going to be a 1v3 game. You guys need to 1v3 me. And to facilitate that, my opening hand was something with Archon of Cruelty and a Reanimate. And if you don't know what those are, for example, we can go ahead and very quickly look up. Reanimate is a 1-mana spell that puts a creature from your graveyard onto the battlefield, and Archon of Cruelty, if it enters the battlefield or attacks, target opponent sacks a creature or a planeswalker, and then discards a card, and then loses 3 life, and then you gain 3 life, and then you draw a card. It's a nutty amount of text on the card, but I opened up my game, started first, drew my 8th card, ended my turn, discarding Archon of Cruelty to the graveyard. Turn 2, I played Reanimate, got Archon of Cruelty out, and proceeded to run everybody down for a decent bit of the game. However, because I had told everybody that this was an arch-enemy game, they needed to control what I was doing, and I was going to do nutty plays like this. Guess what? I actually ended up losing. The player to the right of me was playing a Skithirex deck and actually managed to get the things they needed to eliminate me, even through all of my control, with the help of the other 2 people at the table. And nobody really complained during that game, despite there being a Skithirex deck at the table of all things, because the control deck, mine, kept the Skithirex deck under control, and the Skithirex player and everybody else as a team stopped me from just running to the races with a deck that very much was able to do so if it was left unchecked. Now, had I not had that discussion, they might have eliminated my Archon of Cruelty early and then considered me not to be the threat anymore, and then I would have just taken over the game again anyway, and nobody would have felt very great about that, because it would have been an uphill battle the whole time from the get-go. But it's a much more fair fight when you have that discussion. Hey, my deck does these things. If you're not prepared to deal with these things, maybe select a different deck, or I can select a different deck. Those games are some of the few games that I actually get to remember going forward in Commander, because they are games where players actually looked at what was going on and said, oh, you're right, we can be better, we can do better, we can overcome this control deck, we can make a deck that is stronger irrespective of budget. It's seeing other players through good Rule Zero discussions and being good sports during the games recognize that they can do better and be better at this game, not just by buying more expensive cardboard, but just by recognizing that the social aspect of this game is as important as every other aspect. Your deck's budget is only one part of your power level as a player. How you operate around other players, how agreeable you are when politicking, how often you keep your word when politicking when other players, how honest you are about what your deck does in your Rule Zero discussion, all of these things factor in to whether or not people will want to play with you again in future games. So just don't be an asshole. I guess that's really the entire crux of this, is just don't be an asshole. Just carry decks on you of varying power levels. Hell, if you want to carry an unmodified precon, that's something you can do as well. That way you can hand one to another player if they are struggling with this. If they bring 3 or 4 powerful decks to a table and they don't have anything else to play because they play at a different meta where everybody plays super high power and you're sitting here trying to figure out why nobody at your table is having fun. There's lots of ways you can go about this. Just be honest about what kind of game you want to have and make sure you take the steps you need to have that kind of game. If you want to have a high power slugfest, let everybody know that's what you want to do. If your deck wins on turn 3, usually be honest about that. If your deck doesn't usually win on turn 3, but it can, yeah, probably be honest about that one too. Because then people don't get blindsided and get butthurt. Now, you can't control for every type of player. You can't control for every type of way somebody might get butthurt about Rule Zero. But you can at least do a little better. Rule Zero is not some bar preventing you from playing the Magic you want to play. Rule Zero is a gateway that should allow everybody to play the kind of Magic they want to play, so long as the discussions we have on it are better. Rule Zero is not the only thing stopping you from bludgeoning people with giant, overpowered CEDH decks, and Rule Zero is not something that you should be complaining about when you bring a deck that is a precon to a table of people who have super high-powered decks. If you're honest about what kind of deck you're bringing to the table with everybody else, it's probably going to be a more enjoyable game for everyone there. It's just a conversation about what kind of game you're trying to play. Somehow we've managed to get a stigma on it. I've even made videos on how the Rule Zero conversation is very, very flawed, and I think I'm going to be revising that particular stance from Rule Zero is flawed because it's bad or whatever, to Rule Zero is a conversation that we do not have effectively, and as players, as a community, we can all have a more effective conversation about it. Unfortunately, my channel is not of an adequate size for my opinion to really go anywhere aside from the handful of people who watch my videos, some of which do go to my LGS. But maybe if more people have discussions about how to have effective Rule Zero conversations, what effective Rule Zero conversations look like, and more people who are having those conversations are willing to play different decks as opposed to saying their deck is a certain power level because they just really want to play Yuriko that day and they don't want to play anything else. Be honest about your deck. Don't just walk in with one deck you want to linearly play and then lie about it or find some way to make the players okay with it. Just let people know, hey, I really want to play Yuriko today. Do any of you have a deck that can stand up to what Yuriko is known for doing? Hey, I really want to play Urza today. Do any of you have something that can stand up to what Urza is doing? If the players at your table don't have that, you can get up and find another pod where players might have that power. Or if players don't have what they need to handle it, but they are willing to play with you anyway, everybody knows what they're walking into. They know they're stepping into a high-powered game where one deck is going to be the archenemy. And now, You get to have a bunch of learning moments with a bunch of people as they learn how to navigate the bullshit that Urza is known for doing. Every artifact gets to be mana, so I get to storm off with all of my gray cards. It's a fun deck, I'm not gonna lie. I'm not gonna tell you you can't play the deck. I'm just gonna say have an honest conversation about the games where you want to play that. Commander is a social format. We don't get to always apply the rules of tournament formats to it. We don't get to say, well, you don't get to stop me from playing the deck I want to play. Yeah, we can. We can all get up and leave you. You can find a different table yourself. It's very easy to not get invited to the next pod. The only enforcement engine is you, me, and our ability to agree on what words we are saying and what they mean. So just don't be a dick about those words. It's perfectly reasonable to just be honest. That said, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. I know that this is a very, very wordy rant video, but people are talking about Rule 0 again, so I figured I'd throw my hat in. I'm also going to be starting a new project on the channel aimed at getting new players into Magic. Not just the Start Magic Here series where I'm talking about, hey, run more interaction. Hey, here's some budget draw options. I also want to make some starter decks, basically. My $15 decks are aimed at players who already know what the hell they're doing and know how to navigate within the space that I'm giving them. But I think maybe a $20 starter deck that is aimed at having very, very simple cards, and it's not just the offerings that Wizards of the Coast gave us. They gave us 5. They need to give us more. I think it'd be a good idea to do some videos on starter decks, stuff that is generally good for new players, or even better, players who can't learn Magic the Gathering very easily, but still want to play with people, and so they need to find some way of doing so. Something simple they can put in their hands and then be able to sit down at a table with other people. So I'm going to be working on that as well. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Hit the like button, all that other fun stuff that YouTube likes, and insert end of video tagline here. Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability a Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here. And they would be Red Joker, Britzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Mabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.